I recently picked up a copy of Gunslingers in Action from 1974, which details the exploits of the AH-1 Cobra during the Vietnam War. The Cobra was introduced into American service in 1967 and went on to be used until 2000. The single-engine attack helicopter quickly proved its worth as a gunship being utilised in a ground attack role, flying as part of hunter-killer teams alongside Hugh's AH-6A Cayuse scout helicopters. The book details the experiences of Captain Hugh Mills, who joined the US Army in February 1967. After attending officer training at Fort Knox, he later graduated from flight school in November 1968 and first set foot in Vietnam on New Year's Day 1969. Over the course of his 2 tours of Vietnam, Mills served with the Aero Scout Platoon, D Troop, 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry, and for his second, shorter 4-month tour of Vietnam in 1971 with the 101st Airborne as a Cobra pilot. After the 101st left Vietnam, Mills resumed command of the Aero Scouts in South Vietnam. During his time in country, he flew 3,300 combat hours in both AH-6A Scouts and Cobras in over 1,000 combat missions, being shot down no less than 16 times. Mills is often cited as one of the most legendary aviators of the conflict, being highly decorated for his service. Using Mills's recollections, in this video I'll tell 2 stories from his time flying over the skies of Vietnam. From December 1971 through February 1972, the 101st Airborne was phasing down its operations in I Corps, preparing to leave Vietnam. There were no ground combat units committed to action in northern South Vietnam. We were the only people up there involved in any combat. Our mission was to provide visual reconnaissance, security and attack helicopter raids. We flew standard heavy hunter-killer team, consisting of 1 AH-6A Scout, 2 AH-1G Cobras and a UH-1H with Rangers on board to act as pickup aircraft in case someone went down. On the particular day of this incident, I was giving check rides in the Cobra, fulfilling my obligations as the unit instructor pilot. We had a team out in the general area of Khe Sanh performing a visual recce. The air mission commander was Captain Noel Harvey, who was flying the Huey. They had finished a visual recon of Route Red Bull, which ran out to Khe Sanh from Camp Carroll, and we were coming back to Quang Tri along Highway QL9. The 2 Cobras were leading the way, with the Loach in tow, the Huey lagging a little behind. The whole force was at an approximate altitude of 6,500 feet. As they passed Khe Sanh, the lead Cobra called the CNC aircraft to see if he was having any trouble keeping up. Captain Harvey keyed his mic and began to assure the Cobra that he was doing okay. They never heard all the transmission. There was a loud noise over the radio and Captain Harvey called, "Taking fire, taking hits!" Then the radio went dead. Lieutenant Brewer, who was leading the Cobras, immediately hauled his snake around. He spotted Harvey's Huey in flames at 58,000 feet going down. He repeatedly called Harvey on the radio, but got no answer. By the time they got to his position, Harvey was impacting on the ground. He landed about 700 yards due south of the old Marine base at Khe Sanh. The Cobras made an initial pass over the crashed Huey and saw the crew get out on the ground. They called back to base requesting additional help in the way of another fire team. The Loach, flown by WO1 Major Hendricks, flew over the crash site and as he hovered to land, took a heavy burst of AK fire, which killed his door gunner and crippled his aircraft. He managed to limp off to Khe Sanh, where he landed and covered himself until another Huey came out to get him. I got the word from operations to scramble a fire team of Cobras. We had a bit of a hang-up initially, since we had no gunships up that were armed. The snake that I was using was a trainer, but we quickly got squared away, and I led the team out. My wingman was McD Cockerell, Charlie Horse 45. Old Mac was the oldest officer in the troop, and the only other IP in the unit. He was probably the finest gun pilot I have ever seen, bar none. Mac's aim was deadly, and he was cool and combat experienced. He was my mentor in gunships, and transitioned my brain from 40 knots in scouts to 190 knots in gunships. While we were en route to the crash site, the people on the ground began to take small arms fire on their position. The enemy was from 30 to 40 metres away from them, and they could hear the MVA shouting back and forth to each other as they began to encircle the downed aircraft. They called Brewer for some supporting fire to discourage the enemy. Brewer immediately made some firing runs, putting 2 7.5 rockets all around the downed Huey. This seemed to take the pressure off as the MVA voices were stilled. I was on my way up the Barlong Valley with the gunships and still about 15 minutes out when they began to receive grenades over their position from 30 to 40 metres away. The Rangers began heaving grenades back at the unseen enemy. One of the door gunners stood up and began firing his M60. He was shot through the head and killed instantly. The enemy automatic weapons fire seemed to pick up in volume. Brewer had continued to make runs to the suspected enemy positions, but the close proximity of the MVA to the friendlies made his fire largely ineffective. The situation had deteriorated to a firefight between the enemy force and the 9 guys on the ground. Brewer called with an up-to-date appraisal of the situation while I was still 7 minutes out. He was quite low on fuel and had to break station to return to Quang Tri. We pulled up to the area at 1,500 feet. I was acting as Air Mission Commander. Since we had no other aircraft in the vicinity to guide us, I had to guess their general whereabouts by map coordinates. I spotted the down aircraft and made one pass directly over the top of it at 50 feet. Captain Harvey waved as I went over and pointed in the general direction of southwest. I pulled out, at still 50 feet, and made a wider sweep. Around the downed Huey, about 200 metres I looked down, and directly below me on Route 616, which runs south out of Khe Sanh, I spotted 5 or 6 MVA in dark green fatigues, with pith helmets, carrying AKs. They looked up at me and ducked, but didn't fire. I radioed this information to Mac, and he rolled them on from 1,500 feet. I swung out farther to the north to see if there was any way that I could get to the people on the ground, to walk out to an improved highway about 150 metres away where they could be picked up. As I did that, I flew over QL9, which runs east and west just south of Khe Sanh. Passing over the highway, I was fired on by an NVA 50 caliber machine gun which missed me. I stayed low as I flew up to Khe Sanh, then popped up to 1,500 feet to get some standoff. I plotted the location of the 50 caliber and we worked on it first, so that we could stay in the area. Mac got it. Captain Harvey called us and told us that they were not then getting a lot of fire, but they could hear people moving around them. They estimated the enemy force at about company strength. After 2 passes at the 50 caliber site, we returned to the downed Huey, since my Cobra was armed with the XM135 20mm cannon. Harvey requested that I come in and lace a pattern around their position. As I did this, Harvey reported that AK fire had increased tremendously and in its intensity. The MVA was shouting commands back and forth again, and they made a full frontal assault on the position of the crew. The Rangers beat back the charge, but in the fight the second Huey door gunner was killed. Harvey was hit in the arm, but continued to fight. Our estimate of enemy strength was now a company plus, completely surrounding the down crew. We had no way of getting them out. My troop commander, Major Joe Seary, had just arrived overhead in a CC Huey, and I advised him of the situation. An Air Force signed wire FAC, flying an AH-1, also arrived on station. After appraising the situation, called back to Da Nang, asking for a Jolly Green team of the 37th Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron. The Jolly Greens were bounced immediately. They consisted of a pair of A-1 Sandys and C-130 King aircraft and 2 HH-53 Jolly Greens. The A-1 arrived on station first, while we were still working our rockets into the area around our people. Mac, who was flying a heavy hog, expended all of his rockets, and I sent him back to rearm. At this time the whole troop had come up on scramble alert, and they were arming all of our aircraft and all of our Rangers to get in and get the crew out. The elapsed time since they'd gone down was now about an hour and a half. Major Seary relayed the information back to the Commanding General of the 101st, General Hill, who stood up the 502nd Airborne Infantry Battalion, which had been in a stand-down posture prior to leaving the country. If it got too close to dark and we still hadn't gotten them out, the 502nd was primed for an air mobile assault. We also had attached to us a company of CCN known as the Hoc Bao. They are a combination of Nung mercenaries and South Vietnamese Montagnards. They are vicious fighters, real good people to have on your side. I returned to My Lac, a staging field between Khe Sanh and Quang Tri, reloaded, refueled and returned to the area. The 2 A1s were on station. Since they had the capability to loiter longer and deliver more ordnance, I relinquished control of the operation to Sandy 8, who immediately established radio contact with Captain Harvey. Harvey, suffering from loss of blood, severely shaken from the continuous enemy fire, told them that his people were out of ammunition and they couldn't last much longer. The A1s set up a racetrack pattern around the Huey and began to sterilise the area with 250 and 500 pound bombs, rockets and 20mm cannon fire. After about 45 minutes of this, the enemy fire subsided. Sandy 8 decided to bring in the first Jolly Green. While all of this was going on, we flew a wider circle around the position, keeping an eye out for enemy movement on the roads. When we spotted them, we ran in with the turret miniguns 40mm and the 20mm. After the first Jolly Green came to hover over the downed crew and put a paramedic to aid the wounded, about the time his PJ touched on the ground, the big AH-33 began to receive an intense volume of fire from the enemy. He was hit repeatedly and he was forced to abort, leaving the paramedic behind. He did manage to limp back to Da Nang, but was too badly damaged to fly again. The Sandys decided that the area was still too hot to bring in the second Jolly Green, so they went back to work on it, blasting away at the dense jungle around the Huey. They discussed with me the possibility of using an agent they called Hobart. They told me that it was an incapacitating gas that would knock out everyone on the ground within 300 meters, good guys and bad. The after effects would make them pretty sick for about a week, but that might be the only way they could cool the area down enough to get them out. Sick for a week was better than dead forever. I told them to do what they thought was necessary and accomplish the mission. They deferred their decision on Hobart for the time being and continued to work the area over with conventional ordnance. About that time, we spotted a platoon of MVA moving over a hill crest and down into a wooded draw. I rolled with my gunships and let fly with 17-pound high explosive and flechette rockets. We drew no return fire. After about 3 hours of additional prep, the Sandys fired a protective smokescreen of white phosphorus and called in the second Jolly Green, which was flown by the squadron commander. He came to hover over the Huey, dropped his PJ and began to extract the crew. The whole time he was at hover, the Jolly Green put out a tremendous volume of fire from the miniguns in the sides and tail, and the A1s provided a continuous blanket of 20mm fire around the area. They got all the people on the ground up, buttoned up and headed for Da Nang without further incident. Every member of the down crew, with the exception of Lieutenant Neil Flynn, the co-pilot, was wounded. It was later determined that they had been under attack by a reinforced MVA battalion. General Hill did insert the 502nd, which swept through the area, hoping to police up any remaining enemy. They counted 100 MVA bodies within 50 metres of the downed Huey, and we counted another 50 within 300 metres of the position. The Huey was too badly damaged to salvage. We blew it in place. The operation concluded with the extraction of the infantry at about 1830 hours. The date was January 29, 1972. We were working a hunter-killer mission in the tri-border area, the northwest corner of South Vietnam, where it meets the borders of Laos and North Vietnam. We consisted of the standard hunter-killer team for that area and that time, a pair of Cobras and an OH-6A Scout of Delta Troop, 3rd Squadron, 5th Cav, 101st Airborne. In addition to the hunter-killers, we were also accompanied by our own self-extraction team, which was a AH-1 loaded with Rangers. If one of the hunter-killers was shot down, the Huey would come in. The Rangers were there for strictly perimeter defence while the rescue was being made, and extract the crew who had been shot down. We did this because we had no direct Jolly Green Giant support. The UH-1M was flown by Captain Joe Lassiter, our operations officer. His call sign was Charlie Horse 3. I was Air Mission Commander and was flying a Cobra. My call sign was Charlie Horse 38. My wingman was Lieutenant Lou Brewer, who was later shot down by a Strela missile and killed at An Loc. His call sign was Charlie Horse 34. The Loach was flown by WO1 Tim Knight. SP-5 Rip Smith was his door gunner, and their call sign was Charlie Horse 11. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd been conducting visual reconnaissance along Highway QL9 from Khe Sanh to the Laotian border. It had been a relatively uneventful mission, until I received a call from Air Force Covey, FAC, flying an OV-10. He'd been putting in an Air Force strike on some unfriendlies, and had just lost one of his F-4s to enemy ground fire. He wanted to know if we were in a position to give them some cover until the Jolly Greens arrived on the scene. I rogered that we could, and immediately headed to the area. We arrived in the area and began to look for the downed F-4 crew. It was a heavily wooded area with hills on either side of a small stream. The F-4 crew was somewhere in the base of the stream bed. We stayed high at about 6,000 feet, hoping to catch sight of parachutes in the trees. After a few passes, we decided to put the Loach down low. The FAC said that he had communications with the down crew. We couldn't talk to them because of difference in frequencies. He instructed them to let him know if and when they heard Loach. If the Loach got close, he would then let me know, and I would direct the Loach onto their position. The loach went down and was down about 7 or 8 minutes, before he called up to me that he had spotted the base camp. The camp was active and had people in it that were running at the sight of him. I told him to disregard them and keep up a fast sweep to try and find the F4 crew before we did anything else. About 5 to 10 minutes later, the loach was moving down from the stream bed. He began to receive automatic weapons fire. He called "taking fire" and immediately broke right. As soon as he broke, we rolled from 6,000 feet with both gunships. I was lead and we made one pass with rockets, broke and climbed back up to about 1,500 feet. The loach went back into the area and again received small arms fire. As he broke, we rolled in from 1,500 feet and I fired my rockets. This time I experienced a double hang fire in the left outboard pod. The rocket motors fired, but the rocket stayed put long enough to tear off the aft end of the pod. It hit the tail rotor, knocking it off. The Cobra, unlike the Huey, won't fly straight and level without the tail rotor. Because of the heavy weapons load in the nose, loss of centre of gravity is uncontrollable. The Cobra began to spin, nose low to the right. I rolled the throttle off and held the Silic centred just to keep it level as it spun in, just above the trees. I pulled the Silic all the way to the stops. She stopped her spin and settled into the trees. The trees in the area were now 250 feet high, and upon first impact were lost to the main rotor hub and rotor blades. We rolled, inverted and plunged into the darkness below. I guess I was unconscious for about 5 or 6 minutes. The Aero Scout hovered over the wreckage of our Cobra for about 4 minutes. Observing no life, decided to make a sweep of the immediate area. A few minutes later, the loach came back to find that I'd gotten out of the wreck. I still hadn't regained my senses because I don't remember doing what I did for the next few minutes. I crawled back into the Cobra, retrieved my survival gear and Car 15 automatic rifle, which I stowed behind the armoured seat, and disregarded my helmet in favour of the Stetson cavalry hat we all wore when not flying. The loach was hovering over us. As I looked up at the door gunner, he pulled out a survival radio and started pointing to it, indicating I should get mine out and start talking. That clicked me back to my senses, and I started communicating. I told him that the co-pilot was badly injured and that I had some kind of head injury and felt I could black out at any time. So please keep on talking to me. I walked back to the Cobra to check on my co-pilot, John Bryant. The whole front of the Cobra was smashed and he had a broken back and neck. He was in a great deal of pain. The door gunner on the loach told me that they should be able to get us out without too much trouble, and the Huey was coming in to make the pickup. The Huey came to a hover over us and dropped its rappelling ropes. They were about 40 feet short of hitting the ground, so he pulled up and moved it out about 75 to 100 metres into an area where the trees were not as tall or thick. None of the Rangers had been in combat and had never made a pickup under real conditions. One of the Rangers, the medic, had never rappelled out of a helicopter and forgot to double loop the rope through his snap link. He free rappelled all the way down to the ground, losing his M16 in the top of a tree and badly banging himself up en route. Nevertheless, he was the first one to reach me as the Rangers came thrashing through the jungle. They moved in and helped me crawl back into the Cobra and drag the co-pilot out. We didn't know how we were going to get out since the ropes were too short to reach us, and the jungle too thick to move very far in with an injured man, and there was no clearings within easy walking distance. Just then, one of the Rangers who had moved up from the slope to our position began to fire his M16 to cover himself as he backed down the hill towards us. The rest of the Rangers began to fan out upslope, setting up a defensive perimeter. Things were beginning to look increasingly grim for us. I called Brewer and explained the situation. I told him that they'd better figure out some way to get us out pretty quick, because the bad guys were probably converging on us, and I didn't think we could hold them off for very long. He told me that Air Force FAC had called out for a Jolly Green team, which had been scrambled with a pair of A1 Sky Raiders for fire support. The minutes dragged by with everyone getting edgier by the second. There had been no additional contact with the enemy, but we all imagined them sneaking in on us, getting ready to lower the boom. I could hear the OV-10 overhead and occasionally spotted him as he made a pass over our position. After about half an hour or so, there was a loud explosion 25 metres down slope from us. I figured it was a grenade and thought the MVA were finally beginning to probe our position. I called the Cobra for some support. He replied that the explosion was a White Phos rocket from the OV-10 fired to mark our position. The Jolly Greens were in the area and coming to pick us up. A few minutes later, the big HH-53 came to hover over us, blowing my hat off and down into the stream bed. I never recovered it. A door on the right side of the Jolly Green opened and a paramedic carrying a litter climbed onto the jungle penetrator at the end of the hoist, which began to make the 300-foot descent through the trees. When he reached the ground, we gently loaded Brian onto the litter and they hauled him to safety. In deference to my head injury, they also made me ride the litter up to the Jolly Green. The rest of them came up 2 at a time on the Jungle Penetrator. When they had us all aboard and buttoned up with the A1 strafing on the other side of us, we climbed for Da Nang in safety. The second Jolly Green in the team, with the aid of the sophisticated tracking equipment, located the F4 crew and made a successful pickup of them. John Bryant spent 3 weeks at the 90th Evacuation Hospital in Da Nang and then was medevaced to the States. He is in fairly good shape, though still under care at the Brooke Army Hospital. I would like to add that the Air Force was good, very professional and very cool under pressure. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll catch you again soon.